Welcome to Crossroads and Cauldrons. We are two witches with jobs, families, and busy lives just like you. We talk about weaving the web of community, practicing magic, and life in the Deep South. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm Selena, and you're listening to Crossroads and Cauldrons podcast. We have a fantastic guest with us today. I'm super excited to have him on the show. He's been on my list for a while, and he's got a new book out, which I just finished reading last night, and it's fantastic. So Jason Miller is our guest today. He has devoted 35 years to studying practical magic. He's the author of 6 books, including the now classic Protection and Reversal Magick. He teaches online courses, including strategic sorcery, the Sorcery of Hekate, and the Black School of Saint Cyprian. So welcome, Jason. It's so nice to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. Wow. Hearing that bio read back, the 35 years, I'm like, wow.
It hits, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I'm looking at the monitor and the gray. I mean, I've had gray since I was like 35, so I can't complain too much, though. My dad was completely bald by like 22. Like he had that 70s comb over with like the strands of hair that are just like slick. So
little stringy ones, yeah.
Right, I still have hair. I had COVID hair down to my shoulders, so you know. I'm going to be 50 at the end of the year, so I'm doing all right. I guess I can't complain, but still, 35 years in magic, witchcraft, and the occult. Ooh.
Wow. And then there was probably time before that, but we won't count that time. Now, I hear you on the gray. I've been going gray since I was 18, though, so it doesn't quite have the same impact, but it's starting to get there. But anyway, I'm happy that you're here. I like I mentioned, I just finished this book last night. I have a digital copy, so I can't show them the beautiful cover, but I'm sure it will be in our social media posts later.
I just got copies.
Oh, wonderful.
So I just got my own physical copy, so I can.
Oh, it's so beautiful. I love the cover art. And all the art inside.
Right?
It's gorgeous.
I mean, the cover is, so the art inside is done by my friend, Matthew Brownlee, a longtime friend, old roommate. We knew each other in high school. And the cover art is done by Cambian Art, who it's from a collection that he's doing of the spirits of the Goetia. And they're not finished, and he's so cool. He's very kind. He gave me a whole bunch of other ones to use in like blogs and promos and things. And sadly, he doesn't do commissions because I was like, I love your work. I would love to just get you to do a painting, and he doesn't do that. He's busy. But Wiser found him for the cover, and I was just like, wow. Because his vision of those spirits is very, very close to my own, very close to how they appear to me. Whereas so many other depictions of them are like, they're demonic in like horror movie ways. It's like, the bat wings and the horns and the dripping blood fonts and things. They don't appear like that to me. They're much more elegant. They're much more earthy, right? Mm-hmm. They're chthonic in that sense. And he just nailed it. So Cambian Art, that's not his name. It's his company name. But better to go with that. But great job to both artists. So I'm happy.
The artwork is fantastic. That's what struck me the most is when I initially saw the cover art, I was like, I'm reading this book. It's beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about consorting with spirits. So many people, this is a big topic that people have a lot of feelings and a lot of thoughts about and a lot of misconceptions. So I'm so thrilled that you've written this book. I wish I had this book 20 years ago, but I'm glad that I have it now, and I'm glad that others have it now. So your approach to spirit work is super practical. And this is what I try to impress on my students so much. So your book is probably going to be required reading material for my students going forward. But treating spirits the way we would treat physically manifest spirits, like people and animals and plants, that is the way to approach working with spirits. And it's hard to get that into people's heads. So talk to me a little bit about the way that you approach spirit work and the way you approached writing this book and putting this information out there.
Yeah. So there's a few ways that I view spirits and magic that I notice are different than how a lot of other people view them. And then there are some things that aren't necessarily different than how other people view them, but they don't get talked about as much in books. So the title Consorting with Spirits comes from, first of all, it's a nod to a crime. Like, if you or I got caught in 17th century England doing what we do, we might be charged with consorting with spirits. Mm-hmm. So, but apart from that, the idea of consorting is regular, like meeting regularly. Like if we meet once, we're not consorting. But if suddenly we're out and about all the time and people see us, then we're consorting, right? Mm-hmm. And both Merriam-Webster and Oxford English also add in, usually with like, undesirable people or people who are, nefarious. Mm-hmm. So there's that you're spending time with the wrong kind of people. And of course, spirits, as far as society goes, whether it's the religious establishment or the scientific establishment, you're kind of, you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. So I loved it because, anyone might summon a spirit. And I think even some magicians and witches, they have the idea like, well, I want to do this, so I better look in the book and find what spirit is associated with this, call that spirit once, and then it's over.
Like a vending machine.
Right, yeah, like vending machine. And you know what? It's a way to do magic. It's okay. But I always think that the mark of a successful and long-term, and again, 35 years, wow, work in this field is that you develop relationships with spirits. You have ongoing and transforming relationships with spirits, and much in the same way that you do with people. And so the way that you approach them matters. The fact that you never, spirits are more subtle, like the non-incarnate spirits, because you're absolutely right. We're spirits as well. We're organized and oriented around bodies. But other kinds of spirits that we typically think of spirits, they're organized and oriented in other ways that, from our perspective, are more subtle than we are. And yet, people are willing to accept that they don't know everything about another person. Yet they're very ready to pigeonhole the spirit into, well, this is what it is and this is what it isn't. And, I'm going to act like that's true. So my theology, if I have one, is that there's more out there than we know, and there's more out there than we can know. And so whatever I know about the spirits isn't a full picture. And some of what I think might be incorrect. It may be meaningful and it may be useful, but it may prove factually incorrect. So I have this very different approach, and it really does boil down to so many issues are solved by, think about this if this was a person, right? One of the classic things that exists in really every tradition the world over is how do you tell if a spirit is telling you the truth, right? And so some will say, well, there's divination and then others will say, well, there are names and you force it to tell the truth, right? And then there are, so you've got these protocols that are relied upon. But if you think about it in terms of people, that all falls apart. Right? And the protocol is actually dangerous in a way, because if I'm lying to you, the best thing that I can do is convince you that I can't lie because you have something over me, right? When in fact you don't. So once you've established, like, well, now this spirit cannot lie because I bound it under the name, Jehovah, JHVH1. It cannot possibly lie. Well, now if it's lying, it's like, I can tell this dude anything. And so I'm always just like, look, just evaluate the information the same as you evaluate other information. It's a data point. Does it make sense? Is it actionable? Is there great risk in taking the action? If not, then give it a whirl. If so, then maybe be careful. And
that applies over time too. That goes back to having a relationship, which we'll talk about more later on. But observing, okay, this is what I'm hearing. This is the actions that I'm seeing. Are they in sync or are they out of sync with each other? That's why, building a relationship over time is better than just a one-on-one situation.
Absolutely.
That's like grabbing somebody off the street and saying, hey, I want you to help me with winning the lottery.
Right.
You don't know who this is. They don't know who you are. They're going to be like, sure, I can help you with that. What's in it for me? Right.
Exactly.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, this is why offerings are so key. Right. When I explain offerings, I say, listen, if I need to borrow $100 and I go to my best friend, he's just going to be like, here's $100. Do you need more? Are you okay? Right. And I'm like, if I go to a coworker, maybe he will, maybe he won't. Maybe she will, maybe she won't. Depends. Like, do we have a long history of going out to lunch where 1 week she pays, 1 week I pay? Well, those are offerings, right? That builds trust and exchange and things like this, where we rely upon one another. So maybe yes, maybe no. But if I go up to a complete stranger, they're going to be like, no, why would I do that? So that's relationships. Offerings are great for building relationships. And yeah.
You mentioned before about how different spirits are organized. One of the things that people, okay, hold on. Words. So I relate it to visiting a foreign country, a country that has a culture that's completely different than, not like going to England. Okay, I could be fine over there, but like going to a completely different culture. And I may have an idea of, what I read in the travel brochure, right? But once you spend time and immerse yourself in that culture, all of these different subtleties of communication and nuance awaken for you and for your experience. And that completely shifts your perspective on dealing and relating with people from that culture. And the same thing, I have found the same thing is true in working with spirits. Some are more, in line with the way I already think, but a lot of them are not. Yep. And that's kind of the way I approach working with them, is learning a different culture. And how would you approach immersing yourself in a different culture? So you mentioned in the book how that spirits are organized consciousness, and they're organized in different ways that, as you mentioned, we can't pin down, and people try to pin them down. But there are some ways that appear to be consistent. I'm not going to say universal, but people consistently have similar experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about some different ways that those consciousnesses are organized?
Sure. So, when we contact a spirit, let's say the Archangel Michael, right? So that spirit, at least our experience of that spirit, things that play into its organization, the religion that it's now associated with, even if Michael was another kind spirit before that, right? Um, for 2,000 years, an archangel within Christianity, longer than that within Judaism. So it's organized around religion. It's organized around culture. Um, that doesn't mean it's confined by those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are other things that it can be organized around. It's organized around the concept, a martial concept, right? Like what makes Michael different than other angels. So it's organized around this martial concept. It's organized around angels in general, I find, are organized around being representatives of a deity. So there's an element of collectivism and conformity that, say, is different when you're working with demons, which are really organized around the ideas of rebellion and independence. And so you've got these things, and it's vast. Michael is vast. You or I can call upon Saint Michael anywhere on the globe and get a response. Now, if we are at a shrine to Saint Michael, we might get a stronger response, because then that vast spirit starts to be organized around a place as well that is sacred. So it's worth pilgrimages and things like this to get. It's almost like finding a place where you get better reception.
No, that's a great analogy.
Right, it moves closer to the physical. That bridge becomes easier. And so, but then maybe if that's a very public and crowded place, so you gain a little foothold as far as Michael becoming more physical in that spot, but you also gain more distractions, so your ability to bridge it from your end goes down, right? So it's almost like, well, I can go to where the signal is stronger, but I can't bring my best antenna. So it's a game, and people, when I explain this to people, they're like, "Oh, it's you're being so complex," whereas other teachers are just like, "It works this way," and I'm like, "Yeah." Because it's more like a more subtle being, you should expect it to be more fluid and complex than dealing with people, not less. And so the other, like, let's take another example to compare. I've got a creek on my property. It runs through my property here in Vermont. There is a spirit or a group of spirits to that creek. They are very physical, like really close. They are also not vast. If you were to invoke the spirit of the creek, even if I were to give you a name and a seal that I've bound it to or something, I don't think you would get much of a response.
Mm-hmm.
It's oriented around this physical location and not anywhere else. Now, maybe if we started a cult and spread it everywhere and built shrines, then it would reorganize itself that in a vaster way. But not right now, right?
It's sort of like if I went outside in my yard and shouted to my neighbor across the street, they're going to hear me.
Yeah.
But if I went out in my yard and I shouted to you in Vermont and I'm in Mississippi, you're not going to hear that. You're not going to know I'm calling. But we've set up all of these telephone lines between here and there. So I could use that now that all of that's established and place a phone call to you. You know? Okay, keep going.
But it also changes, it might change the orientation of that spirit. That spirit might grow and become more vast, or perhaps merge with other types of spirits over time, because that's the other thing. people will look at a spirit like Astaroth, who I, talk about extensively in the book. And some people will say, well, Astaroth is a demon listed in these grimoires. And then other people will say, no, Astaroth is not a demon. Astaroth is Astarte, the ancient goddess. And it's sort of like, well, it's not that simple, right? It's not like Selena is a podcaster, but Selena is also a daughter and, whatever other roles you have. So spirits are more subtle, more fluid. So just like humans being oriented to bodies, we kind of have a myriad of futures open to us, but a past more or less in a straight line. Whereas spirits might have multiple pasts and multiple futures open to them at any given moment, because they're oriented in a way that's different than how we are. A way that we can understand some of, but there are things that we might not even have the capacity to understand.
I was going to ask you, what do you feel is the we have an impact from interaction with spirit, and we our consciousness evolves as we sort of understand from a different perspectives. Just like if we were relating with other people, the more people we know and talk with, the more our understanding of the world expands. Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the impact of human consciousness for them, on the spirits themselves, as they are also evolving?
Well, it's let's say that we give and I think that this is probably correct, that the existence of Hekate is not dependent upon human understanding. Like, there's an element of Hekate that is primordial. That doesn't mean that she would be known by a name that has a Greek etymology, right? Or that if that being were able to be contacted, say, on another planet by another civilization entirely, that she would have stories about leading someone into the underworld, or as the transcendent goddess between the first and second father in the Chaldean oracles, or as a titaness that aided the gods. Like, these very specific stories become part of them and part of their organization, and the element of their organization that we can access them through, right? So it's just like, if we were here on the interview and I just started referring to you as, like, listen, sweetie, you would just be like, what a... I don't know if I can curse.
You can
or not,
swear.
but,
you can swear on the show.
Idea.
Yeah.
What, right? Like, what a condescending jerk this guy is being. But if your significant other was to say, all right, well, listen, sweetie, mm-hmm. It's very different, right? Because they're accessing you through that way that your consciousness is organized. So if I were to access that, it would be inappropriate, which is why I would never do that.
And I appreciate that about you. Thank you. No, I really like what you're saying there, because we sort of forge I guess we interact with or pick up on a particular spirit entity, and then we forge our own bridge to that. And through that, other humans have access to the bridge by, I guess, our nature of being human. So yeah. that entryway will be different for entities approaching from a different bridge, crossing a different bridge to get there. Interesting. You're giving me a lot to think about, which is my favorite. So you're talking, I wonder if that's why so many people have initial spirit contacts with ancestors, because they're connected through the DNA to people that are much closer to them spiritually.
You're a walking, talking, physical link to your ancestors. Whether you like your ancestors or not,
you have that bridge installed.
Right.
Interesting. So you talk about, in the book, you talk about consorting with spirits you're approaching it from 3 very specific systems in the book. So you're coming from a Christian perspective, a pagan perspective, and a Luciferian perspective. Can you talk to me about why you chose those particular approaches?
I'm not particularly like a Luciferian or anything, and as I said, my theology is there's more out there than we know and more out there than we can know. Like that's it. That's my religion. I'm initiated into other religions, and I guess from that perspective, I'm a bad member of all of them. Like a bad Christian,
a
bad
heretic
Buddhist,
all around,
bad bad witch, whatever it is. So, because I'm not a person who upholds like faith, dogma, points of view, other than truth. So, or not even, and I don't even claim
than seeking
that.
truth.
So that's, that's where I come from that. But I chose these 3, because, and really from the magical perspective, it's almost 2, because Luciferianism really only exists within the context of Christianity.
Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of a like what I sometimes refer to Christio-diabolism, right?
Oh, I love that.
Right. So the view of that would be that it's not an either or side, right? It's almost like the heavens and the angels represent collectivism and a larger perspective, and the devil, for lack of a better, and the demons represent rebellion against that, and individualism. And the thing is, people are like, well, isn't that one side versus the other? And I say, well, no, because like you were a teenager once, right? Like part of growth is getting these rules handed to you that are, we hope, good guidelines, right? And then rebelling against them to test their boundaries, and then seeing which ones that we look on and like, actually, mom and dad were right. That's probably not a good fit, good rule to break. And then other things we look back on and like, no, they were wrong. This is the good way. And then there are certain things where, again, it's a balance. There's like, too much collectivism leads to stifling any freedom. Too much individualism leads to stifling or neglecting those around you, because or any kind of collective solution. So those two are kind of connected in my head. But the way that you approach spirit work from, it really matters. And since in the book I decided, about halfway through the book, I start to get into evoking spirits, which most people relate to the grimoires, right? And so people always want to take these seals and these spirits and say, but I don't want to do it from a Christian perspective. I just want to throw all that Jesus stuff in the garbage, but I want to keep the names and the seals because they're cool. And I want to do it invoking by using pagan gods, or I want to do it by using Luciferian methods. And so the point in the book is that the names and the seals arose within a certain context, right? So those were created, and those spirits bound by magicians working in this way. So what makes you think that those things are valid outside of that context, right? Like if you're a supervisor at Ernst & Young, right? Like you're a vice president at Ernst & Young, you can't walk into, I don't know, AT&T and just be like, I'm a vice president. God damn it, you will do what I say, because they're like, not here. Like, that's
right.
Your position is irrelevant. So sometimes people will just take this like, oh, well, all I need to do is like pull these ingredients out and then dribble in the things that I like.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case. It changes the dynamic. So I gave examples of how this dynamic would change. Like, when you're doing it with Hekate, it's not that it can't be done, but now you're invoking something outside of Hekate's traditions and organization. So what bridges that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what are you going to replace that function with?
Right. And then if you're doing it from a Luciferian perspective, you're approaching it in a different way. So as if in the traditional grimoire way of doing it is essentially an exorcism, right? You're going in, exorcism just means binding by oath or adjuring by oath. So in what we think of as an exorcism, you're saying this, you spirit, bad spirit, you're bound. Now go, back to hell or into those pigs or wherever the spirit is going to go. Whereas in an evocation, you're saying, bad spirit, I'm binding you, same name, same powers, appear at the edge of my circle, right? But if you're doing it from a Luciferian perspective, it's different. It's not an enemy power, or it's not the other side. It's your immediate supervisor, right? So you're kind of like, to use the Karen analogy, you're walking in, you're like, I want to see the manager.
Yes. And you might be in the wrong store, so.
Right, you're invoking Lucifer and in this case, the deacons of the Zodiac. And like, and because of this, you've got to do what I say.
Interesting. You mentioned when a little bit earlier when you were talking about how angels and demons are sort of organized and they're not at odds with each other, although they have different functions. And that sort of makes me think about a lot of the process of witchcraft and a lot of the process of soul crafting. If that's our goal, that's my goal. So we'll assume that's our listener's goal, is a process of sort of making and unmaking. And that's how you evolve. That's how you grow. I kind of think of it like building new muscle. You have to sort of tear the muscle in order to expand and make room for new muscle. So for me, that's sort of the function of the demon side of working with angelic races, if you look at them as races. So it's interesting that you put it in that way, because that made some things click for me. Yeah. In your book, you talk about different methods of spirit communication as well, including resonance with spirits, actual channeling communication type spirit, communication with spirits, and then also dreams and receiving information in that way. Can you talk a little bit about the different ways that spirits communicate with us and how we sort of don't always recognize what's happening?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, we've got, if you think about that idea of bridging that gap, of tuning in to be able to communicate with the spirit. There's all these different modes, and sometimes people will just be like, well, whatever the strongest mode is, that's the best. But that's not the case, right? Like, if somebody just needs to tell me something very quick, or pass on a piece of information, or before this interview, we both, I'm sure, got reminders from the app, the scheduling app, like, hey, this is coming up. If we each got a phone call from someone to say, hi, this is so-and-so, this is, it would be annoying, right?
If they showed up at my house to let me know, that would be annoying.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody's knocking on the door, like, just to let you know, you've got this thing coming up. Okay, I got to go on to the next house. So it's not a matter of what is the strongest, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of what's the most appropriate. So the idea of resonance is, it's like one-way communication, or not even. It's just you are now representing that being, or you're making a request to that being in a light way. And it can very quickly, if you're doing, let's say you're doing some, sympathetic magic, right? Mm-hmm. And then you call upon that demon, like, as I drop these coins into this bank, let coins drop into my bank. It's an old Venetian spell relating to the demon Clownet. And so, you don't need to actually have him there, present, full 4K HD in the scrying mirror going, yes, now drop another one. Yes, okay, now I will do this for you. Okay. It's unnecessary. And it very often takes a lot of work and effort and time to get that done. Whereas if you want to, seek out some kind of life-changing advice, or if you have something that you want a spirit to do that is very complicated and nuanced, then or if you think it's a spirit that you, for whatever reason, you want this spirit to do that, and you want to do it through binding it and make sure that it does it, because you're not comfortable with making offerings and asking it, right?
Because you're a control freak. Yeah.
Because you're a control freak, or that's,
I mean, it happens.
System
I have that.
Trained in, or, I'm kind of like you. Like, I'm like, if I have to do that, I'd rather just find somebody else. But then there are other people who have ideas that, like, if you're not doing that, the spirits will just,
That's true. That's true.
So, I don't think that's the case. If anything, I think it's the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's down to what tradition were you trained in. If that's how you were trained to do it, you may not even consider that it could be another way.
Exactly. I always put it up like, look, if somebody like cornered me at a pagan convention, is like, are you Jason Miller? And I'm like, yeah, I'm Jason Miller. And then they like shoved me against the wall, put a dagger to my throat and said, are you really Jason Miller? And I'm like, yeah, I'm fucking...
They make you repeat your name 3 times.
I'm really Jason Miller. And they're like, I bind you by tetragrammaton and this. And if you're not Jason Miller, I'm going to call the cops and have you thrown away. And you must sign this non-disclosure agreement. And, by the time they're done, I'm just like, I am not going to do anything for you that I don't have to do. So... It's like, that's just not how I like to run my life. But other people, that's the only way they can feel comfortable, and will let it go, right? Because you should be able to do that if you need to, right? You should have that in your tool chest if you need to do it. Because you never know. You might ask somebody to do something, and then rarely you will find that person that's just like a bad actor and manipulative and takes advantage. So,
but you don't want to open with that.
Right. You should be able to do it. So these are different ways of communicating, right? Dreams are wonderful. I always consider dreams like, if you dream of a spirit after an evocation and it tells you something useful and meaningful, and that's key, you can almost consider it like, a backup. Like, okay, we couldn't bridge the gap in the evocation, but now that you're in a more subtle state, I can reach you and give you this information. Mm-hmm. But it also might just be that, if you just did an evocation, then an evocation is on your mind. So your acetylcholine neurons, as they make dreams, well, instead of the latest episode of Moon Knight, they're making it out of the stuff you just did, which happened to be the evocation of a spirit. So you can evaluate it based on how useful and meaningful it is, rather than.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, if it's something that's useful and meaningful for you, even if it's something your own mind put together,
Yep.
It's still useful. It's still meaningful. One of the things that you mentioned in the book, which was my absolute favorite. First, I'll mention one thing. There's two things. The first is that people are so concerned with, I can't hear the spirits. I can't hear them. How do I hear them? And they're not at all concerned with, can they hear me? Am I being clear? Am I making myself heard? They don't think about that as much. So I'm super glad that you mentioned that in the book. But also, I think my favorite thing is one of the subtitles in the chapter is "Sit down and shut up," and it's about meditate. Please talk about that, because my students hate hearing me harp about it, and our listeners hate hearing me harp about it. So you get to harp about it for a little while.
Okay, so now there's two different things. I actually have to look in the book and see what I really said, because there are two different things that are really important.
The other thing I want to talk about next, and that's idle time. So
sitting down and shutting up. Okay.
Yeah.
So two things that might look alike. The first of them is meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting down, shutting up, and using your mind to focus in on one thing. Breath, candle flame. Actually, I tend to not like candle flames for various reasons, but breath, a mantra, whatever the focus is. And what you're doing at this point is you sit, you focus, you get distracted. You recognize that you're distracted, you return to the focus. You sit, you get distracted, you return to the focus. You sit, you get distracted for a long period of time. You catch yourself, then you return to the practice with no thought of how long it's been or anything like that. You sit and you let your, you get so distracted, and then you return to the practice. And then you have a few minutes where you're not distracted and you think, I'm really meditating now. I'm focused so well. I'm super meditating. And then, crap, that's a distraction too.
Mm-hmm.
And you return to the breath. So if you're out there and you think you're bad at meditation, you cannot be bad at meditation. It's a human impossibility. Meditation can be disturbing to you, can cause you problems in rare cases. So it's not that it's good for everyone, but what you're doing is you're training the mind to focus, which is important for magic. You're training the mind to recognize distraction, which is super key with spirits, because the first way a spirit is going to communicate is through ideas in your mind. Perhaps even voices. But if you meditate, you get a feel for the texture of your own thoughts and mind.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll be so much more prepared to feel and discern what's a spirit and what's not. Now,
that's such a key. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I
was going to say that's such a key thing, because people come into wanting to learn witchcraft and they have a lot of misconceptions about what meditation is, and that you have to have a completely still mind for an hour, and that's just not it. That's not it at all. And I'm so glad that you spelled it out. Like, you're learning to recognize your voice so that you can discern when it's not your voice. That's the whole point. And you're learning to shift consciousness as well, which just sort of comes naturally through that process.
It does.
So thank you for that. No, continue, please.
So the other side of this, and I'll say that, unfortunately, a lot of the early occult and witchcraft authors, when they talked about meditation, they would say things like, sit and completely clear your mind for 20 minutes or an hour. And it was almost like these people are writing to make it look like they can do that.
Right. It's a constant state of clearing.
Yeah, when they really can't. And when you get into the stuff that is actually written from India and, Tibet and China about meditation, it becomes clear, like, that's not the expectation. That is not the training. Like, sit down and clear your mind. It's almost written to, like, make them look like greater than they are.
And they didn't do anything else that would possibly point to that being the case.
Right. Yeah. So then the other side of this is the idle time. And we don't think about idle time as being something we need to seek out anymore. But we do. The modern world just increasingly made idle time less and less of a thing. We no longer had to just sit and be bored and sit in a car or travel or walk without anything else to occupy us. And then in 2007, we took the last little vestige of idle time and shot it in the head with an iPhone. And so now you don't even get to be idle waiting in line for a coffee. You're checking email, right? Like, idle time is gone. But we need it. We desperately need it, because it is in idle time that we make connections, right? You can read 20 books this year or this month, but if you don't take time that's not occupied, you'll never make the connections between them. You'll never understand them as deeply as you would if you did. That's idle time. And idle time, the sitting, the receiving, the playing with the mind, the letting the mind run free, this is so key for perceiving spirits. And very often people will immediately be concerned with, like, well, what doesn't that let fantasy run? Like, what if I'm having a spirit communication, but if it's fantasy, I don't want that, right? Like, I have to weed that out. Well, first, meditation will give you a good indication if that's the case. But once you're having the experience, roll with it. Fantasize, daydream, play with it, go. And then afterwards, that's when you sit down and you do the analysis. The problem with in the middle of the experience going, am I really having this experience? It's like when you're trying to learn to ride a bike and you get pushed and you don't even know that someone's not hanging onto the bike anymore. But the moment you realize that someone is not hanging onto the bike, you fall.
Mm-hmm.
Because that moment of, I don't know how to ride a bike. Am I doing this? Clip. When people try astral projection, they get the experience of the being free of their body, and then they think, well, can I still feel my body? And then bam. Oh, I guess I was just fantasizing because I can still feel my body. Well,
right.
Yeah, because you're not dead. Like, if you can't feel your body, you're in some deep doo-doo. So it just disturbs, the whole thing. Let it play out, do the evaluation afterwards.
I think there's a difference too between fantasy, between imagination, and between delusion. They don't have to be the same thing. Like, imagination is a bridge. That's how our minds make connections. That's how we explore concepts.
Yeah.
So it may feel like we're making it up, and maybe we are, but at the end of the day, if it's useful, if it takes you to an understanding, then there's nothing wrong with that. It becomes a problem when it becomes delusion. But that's a different thing altogether.
That is a different thing. Yeah. So, I did a lot of training in Tibetan Buddhism. I used to live in Nepal, and they have the way that most Tibetan tantras work is a great saint like Padmasambhava or Milarepa or so on receives a vision of a tantric deity and a mandala that surrounds them, right?
And they're very specific.
Right, it's very specific. And so it's got teeth. It's not just some crap they made up, right? Mm-hmm. Like, It's something that was passed from spirit to them, and then they pass it on to students. But the students don't just keep yelling at the spirit until they get the vision. They actually they dissolve their sense of being. They re-arise as this deity, right? And they visualize. They painstakingly visualize, and it's called generation stage, Kierim, the generation stage, and they generate this visualization, and then they invoke, and they pull that deity into the visualization, right? So then they call that deity, and their visualization and the actual presence becomes inseparable in their mind, at least as long as they're able to hold it. And then after they've sort of stabilized this, and this is the position that all like the magic is done, right? Like, so the magic spells and the action mantras and the offerings and things like this, they're all done from this position. And then there's another stage after that called Zogrim, which is perfection stage, where you do things that will literally, they manipulate the energies of the body so that you have an undeniable experience of what the mind of deity is like. So this would be like inner heat practice. And this is where the sex yogas come in and things like this, because, you know, the orgasm is that ego shattering moment. That's a window. And so if we look at that, you see how important the imagination can be. So it is a way to bridge that, as long as you let your visualization open to vision, right? Visualization is the construction, vision is the reception, but they can meet, and one can turn into the other if you're nimble and you allow it and you're skilled at doing that. But if you're just wishful thinking, then it's all visualization, and you just think, well, whatever I think is true. And so this is why I always say, listen, if the spirit's not telling you anything you don't want to hear, probably not a spirit, right? If the spirit always shows up in full force, like the moment you say its name, maybe not a spirit.
And if they only tell you things that confirm what you already think,
yeah.
Because in my experience, they say they're very alien in a lot of ways, depending on what types of spirits you're working with. They can be extremely bizarre in ways that I don't think I would have had the creativity to imagine. But idle time is so important. I am also an artist, and part of that creative process is also, you know, letting things incubate, letting yourself make connections. And you know, I equate that to the same thing in meditation, letting things integrate, because you begin to understand in different ways. So idle time is so important. For my students that are listening, that doesn't mean you don't have to do your homework, but maybe put the phone down for a little while for your idle time. So I found that for me, I spin and weave, and those are times that my hands have to be doing something, but my hands are doing repetitive things, so they're not, I don't know, maybe I'm ADHD perhaps, but I get tense if I'm not doing something, but that lets my body not distract my mind, and my mind can just relax and wander. So thank you for putting that in the book. There's a few more questions that I have, and I know we're getting close to time, so if you have to go, just let me know.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a few more minutes.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip a few of my questions. One of my questions that I want to talk about is working with local spirits. You know, everybody goes for the deity. Everybody's looking for their matron, right? They're looking for their patron. Let's talk about working with local spirits.
All right, let's do it.
You go ahead.
Well, you know, the thing is, you work with local spirits by being receptive, by making offerings, by researching the area that you live in. And, you can even do the same kind of ritual that you do in an evocation, but instead of a spirit name and a seal, you're saying, this spirit of this place, and the benefit is you get someone and something very, very close to your life, to your issue. It's let's say you go to your local Starbucks and there's a particular person there and they always screw up your coffee, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe they were rude to you or something. Well, do you go to the manager of that store or do you go to the CEO of Starbucks? Right? Like, going to the CEO of Starbucks does not seem like the most direct way to solve this problem. But that's kind of what people do when they're like, I've got this small issue. I need to talk to the most powerful being in the world. Because it's not all about power. It's about locality. And even if you were to able to contact that person, he's going to just filter it down anyway.
To the manager, yeah.
Yeah, so he's going to assign it to somebody in their, like in the region, then the regional manager, and then that manager, and then it also might not have the desired result that you think. So it's better to just handle these things one-on-one if you can, right?
I mean,
like, get the locals on your side.
It might even be maybe you tip that barista a little extra and ask them how they're doing next time. Like, yeah, you could even start there.
Like, are we, was I rude ever? Like, absolutely. So there are these ways that we can work with local spirits. And the other thing is, sometimes you think you're working with a big god and angel or demon, but you're really working with a local representative of the firm. Mm-hmm. What I like to call a mall Santa, right? So the mall Santa idea, and this is an old idea. Iamblichus writes about it. But the idea basically is, when you get to be around 4 or 5 years old, if you celebrate Christmas, of course, you go to the mall and you sit on Santa's lap. And by the time you're 4 or 5, it dawns on you, like, this guy is here all day. He should be in the North Pole making toys. Like, I know how this works now. And there's another guy at another mall, and he doesn't look anything like this guy, even though they're both dressed like Santa. So the conclusion is they work for Santa, right? So you go and you tell the mall Santa what it is you want, and you act like he's Santa, and then he passes it along to the big guy. So it's a little like that. So getting in good with local spirits, working with local spirits, is a way to even strengthen your connection to these big spirits and greases the wheels of getting things done just tremendously. It's been just a huge boon in my life and a lot of my students' lives to just unlock these with offerings.
Absolutely. And that's where we start. The very first thing is, like, what is the genius of the land that you're sitting on, of your house itself. Like, let's start there, and go forth. So I'm glad you mentioned that in the book. Also, I want to talk about one more thing before I release you from my web. So one of the things that particularly we don't have a whole huge Catholic culture down here. We've got a lot of Protestant, Southern Baptist, that sort of thing. So angels and demons to people around here are completely foreign because they don't talk about that even in church, in the way that in the way that Catholicism does. So they're absolutely equally terrified of both angels and demons. Can you talk a little bit about working through the fears that are related to working with angels and demons and what they may be and why we may want to work with them? Just briefly. I know, I heard it. I heard it after I said
it. The fears of angels and demons and really any spirits it are that I'm not working with the highest, goodest God, and therefore everything else is out to get me. And it's just not reasonable. It's just not reasonable. For the longest time, ceremonial magic had this very anti-spiritualist stance, where even if they were invoking angels, they would not ever want you to contact a local spirit because that spirit could tell you anything. Well, yeah, so could
any spirit could tell you anything. In fact,
the books you're working from will tell you this spirit lies his ass off. So it's like it is with people. Are you afraid to go meet people because you're terrified that they will just, wreck your life? If so, then sure, reasonable to be afraid of spirits. But if you have a normal attitude towards meeting other people, then that's kind of how it's going to be with spirits, But lately, I'm seeing even the fear of the gods that people choose to worship, right? Like paganism is becoming a God-fearing religion, which is just weird. But people all the time are like, well, I said that I would pray to the Morrigan or Hecate or whoever it is every day, and I missed a day. So now this goddess is angry with me, and my life is going to be destroyed. And it's like, if that is your view of this god or goddess that you've chosen to work with, why would you work with them willingly? Like, we all have people we need to deal with that are like that, right? Like petulant idiots or easily offended and wrathful. Like, maybe you have people in your family, maybe you have people at your job, and you don't have any choice. But if it's like just, like that person out and about, you just avoid them. So since most people are not, born into a magical family where they must pay homage to these gods, like, why are you doing that? Why would you assume that they're like that? And if you do assume they're like that, why would you even bother with them? It doesn't make any sense. What is the enormous benefit, right? Like, if pagan conventions were run in like the Maldives or Monaco at, where you have to be $1 billion and all the pagan authors are rolling up in Aston Martins and, like we're in a James Bond movie because we all have billions of dollars at our disposal, then okay, yeah, sure. How'd you get it? What spirit? Well, they're a pain in the ass, but, they'll give you $1 billion. Sure, I get it. But that's not how it works, right? So why are you bending over backwards or living in fear? And it's horror movie thinking.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that this magic is out there and it exists to get you in trouble, but not to get you out.
Right.
Is horror movie thinking. Now, the other side of that is that everything is safe no matter what. And that's also not true. That's imagination that's not realistic. Magic is a real thing. Of course there are risks. And so then people will be like, but I don't want risks. I want a sure thing. And be like, well, sorry.
Magic may not be for you.
Right. Nothing
would be for you, yeah.
I always bring up, I just did sort of an expanded edition of Protection and Reversal Magick that's going to come out soon. And so I again pointed out that it's like driving. You know, you get into a car. Every time you do, you could die. You put on a seatbelt, you learn the rules of the road, maybe you take some defensive driving, and then you take your chances. And even if you do everything perfectly, still may have a problem. If you decide to do something risky, like, drive in a stock car race, well, then
you're increasing your chances.
Right. Different car, roll cage, helmet, 5-point harness, so more protection. But it's a risk. And magic is a real thing, so there's a risk. But that doesn't mean that it's inherently risky and that everything is out to get you, which is unfortunately what I'm seeing from more and more people. I don't know where it's coming. I wish I did.
Honestly, I don't either, because coming up in my introduction to witchcraft was in sort of the mid 90s, and it was very more of a hippie sort of vibe. And we just didn't have as much fear related to everything, which seems almost backward. But yeah, there's a lot of fear lately, and I don't know where it's coming from. Go ahead.
I think paranormal, like the popularity of the paranormal shows and things like this, because, these guys go in and they want to make a show. So, of course, it's like, what evil happened here? And, and then there's also the horror movies, and there's also, I don't want to be the old guy blaming the new media, but
these damn TikTok kids.
it is. There are some really like things on the witch talk that I'm sort of like, oh,
bless.
And I'm sure there's great things too. And so as somebody who's not on TikTok, I have to note that I always will hear about the bad,
yeah. And that's the thing, though, too.
If you love TikTok, I'm not out here saying that it's bad and that there's nothing good. I think overall the medium itself is horrible, but so is every other kind of social media. So, but
I'm right there with you on that. I wish I could break away from it. Maybe one day.
If I could uninvent the internet, I would just go back to like doing early Tony Robbins, just taking out ads in papers, selling DVDs, and
do a mail order correspondence witchcraft course.
Absolutely.
Oh my
Absolutely,
goodness.
Yeah.
I remember those days. They went away so fast.
They
so
did.
Fast.
Honestly, we had it right with Web 1.0.
Mm-hmm.
We had it right with emails and Yahoo groups and things like that. And then social media came and the algorithms started, isolating us.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I agree. So I have one more question, and then you're free to go. So what is your next big project? The big project. It doesn't have to be something that's already in the works. It could just be like a pipe dream down the road. But what's the big thing that you want to present one day?
There is I don't have like one single big huge thing. I managed to get a lot of those out in my 40s. So the Sorcery of Hekate, which it's broken up into 3 stages, but altogether it's like a year and a half of training. And the Black School of St. Cyprian and things like this. I am working on something that could potentially turn into a hardcover book, sort of a grimoire. I would love to see that done. But other than that, I have no big, huge, definite chief aim plans until my kids are out of the house. They're hitting their teenage years, and so I'm focusing on that because they're at that point where they don't take as much time because of needs and dad, but that's also the time where you got to kind of be extra vigilant because they're striking out on their own, and the mistakes they can make have big ramifications. And
I'm kind of right there with mine. My oldest she'll be 14 soon, and I'm starting to be like, okay, you've got to shift how you mother, so that's
got to
awesome.
give them the space, yet also be there as the reliable source. Gotta give them some privacy, but not so much that they're
that they're going to do the shit I did when I was a teenager.
Well, the thing is, again, I hate to go back to the digital, but if
it's
you
different.
or I did the things, like some of the things that we probably said or did that maybe they were awful, or maybe, and then the people in the room saw it and heard it and then forgot about it. And now nothing, it's all recorded forever. It follows you to a job interview 10 years later. But also the potential for doing great harm, or doing those stupid things in a way that is visible to everyone everywhere on the globe. Is just, it's terrifying.
Isn't it? They need the space to screw up where it can be contained and they can learn a lesson instead of being raked through the coals because they're kids.
Right. I mean, even in crime, we recognize the need for a juvenile record, right?
Yeah.
But the internet doesn't offer that.
I hadn't even thought about that.
And we've created a culture where everyone is reduced to the worst things that they've ever done or said. So it becomes really scary. Really scary.
Yeah. Well, Jason, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on the show. I do hope you'll come back and speak with us again. I could talk to you all day. Tell our listeners where they can find you.
strategicsorcery.net. That's my website. You'll find my blog, you'll find my courses, you'll find my newsletter. If you want to know what's going on, sign up for the Monday Magic newsletter. You'll get a newsletter most Mondays. And if you don't, then you don't. But when I've got something going on, you'll hear about it. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you again. Thanks for listening, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Blessed be.
Blessed be.
Thank you all so much for listening, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe through your favorite podcast provider. It helps us get our podcast in front of more listeners just like you. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can leave us a voicemail by clicking the link in the description of this episode, and you can always find us on Facebook and Instagram by searching for Crossroads and Cauldrons Podcast.